Good Vibrations.
And welcome to Good Vibrations, episode 122. I'm your guest host, Ivan from Phoenix. And on this episode, we will be interviewing Mark Devlin on his new book, Musical Truth 2. Mark, welcome to your show.
Ivan, thanks for having me on my show, man.
I know that sounds so kind of weird for people who don't know what we're talking about, huh?
Yeah. Well, we live in an inverted society, don't we? Everything's upside down and back to front and sort of satanically inverted. So I thought, why not do that with the show? You know, it's not satanically inverted, it's just inverted.
Yeah, it's a little bit comedic inversion, kind of like our form of newspeak, I guess you can say, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is.
So, Mark, your new book dropped, Musical Truth 2, and last time we spoke was about 2 years ago on the release of Musical Truth 1. So I think you're going to have an audio version of this book as well as the paperback and hardback. So let's give the people that are going to get into this material, let's give them a little preview of what this book is going to be about. What did you feel was missing from the first book that you needed to do the second book? Just a general thing, and then we'll get into each individual chapter.
Sure. Well, Musical Truth Volume 1 was very comprehensive. It was about 170,000 words over 536 pages, but I always knew while I was writing it that the story wasn't going to be completely told in that volume, and that, if anything, is a massive understatement. It was always clear that there was more material that was going to have to go into a Volume 2, and I was conscious of the fact that if I waited and tried to get all this information into the first book, it would take so friggin' long to get out there that a lot of it would be out of date by the time it hit the street. So I decided there's got to be a cut-off point where I say, that's it for Volume 1, let's get it out. Everything else can wait for Volume 2, which can come at a later date. So this is just tying up a few loose ends, going back to a few subjects that were covered in Volume 1 and revisiting them, and also covering some subjects that I didn't get a chance to raise in that first volume. So it's a bit of a mishmash. It's, you know, odds and ends, tying it all together, trying to complete the picture. To be honest with you, I could probably write one of these books every year for the rest of my life. You know, Musical Truth, however many more years I'm going to live. But I really don't have the spirit to be able to do that. I just make the point that this story is so vast and there's so much that continually comes across my radar that it certainly would be possible to do that.
Okay, then let's get right into it. I noticed when we did the first book, you had a few chapters that can kind of go together. But this book, looking over the chapter list, each chapter seems to be its own, pretty much own subject. So we'll go ahead and start right at the top with chapter 1, Acid Rain. And I can tell that acid rain is spelled R-E-I-G-N, as in rulership, not rain, as in the water that falls from the sky. So break that chapter down for us.
Yeah, it's a bit of wordplay there. I wanted to kick off with this chapter because this book is coming out on a very important anniversary, particularly in the UK. So it's 30 years since the acid house scene kicked off, late 1987 and then all through 1988, which came to be known as the Second Summer of Love. And it occurred to me, while I was doing a lot of the research for Volume 1 into the counterculture hippie scene of the 1960s, the First Summer of Love of 1967, which we now know to have been, to a very large extent, co-opted by those nice folks at the CIA, who were directing many of the groups and many of the key icons and the gurus of that time, the consciousness gurus, and flooding the market with LSD and trying to steer off culture in desired directions. That story's been very well told now. But while I was getting familiar with all of that, always in the back of my mind was, this reminds me of something else. This reminds me of what was done in the UK with this whole acid house scene. And this was really the genesis of what's come to be the massive worldwide movement of electronic dance music. And I get into the extent to which that's taken root in Chapter 2. But everything has to have its roots somewhere. And in terms of the club scene now that you get in literally every country in the world, and all these dance festivals and stuff like that, as far as the UK is concerned, it can all be traced back to this movement that was known as Acid House, that came along and totally revolutionised the social scene in the UK and the idea of a weekend night out. So prior to 1987, you had most clubs just playing commercial pop music, or you had specialist scenes like soul, funk, reggae, all these different splintered kind of genres. And then this scene just came out of nowhere, which was connected to what was known as Balearic Beat, this movement coming out of Ibiza. And it was all about mixing up these different styles and just having a completely different approach to music. When this whole thing took off, it went hand in hand with a whole new breed of dance music that was coming over from the States, specifically Chicago, also Detroit and New York, in terms of house music. And it coincided very much with what was going on in the UK. And at the same time as all of that, you had this new, although it wasn't really new, but it was new to the scene, drug known as ecstasy, MDMA. And immediately, you can see the parallels here between what was going on in the 60s when you had psychedelic rock coming along to replace the styles that had gone previously, and you had LSD. And so 21 years later, on the opposite side of the Atlantic, you have this new drug, this new approach to music, and a whole new social movement which swept up hundreds of thousands of young people and steered them off in a certain direction. So during the course of this first chapter, I'm looking at these many parallels and some of the sort of calling cards and suspect little motifs that went into the acid house scene that suggest to a suspicious-minded researcher, like me, that there may be more to know about how this scene evolved. So, you have the official story that these 4 young London DJs went out to Ibiza and they were captivated by the approach to DJing that was being displayed by this guy Alfredo, this Argentinian DJ, and they brought the whole spirit of that Balearic movement back to London, and the scene just took off from there. But for me, that's a very simplistic way of explaining where this whole thing came from, and it smacks of being a cover story. And that there's more to know. Yeah, there's a lot of detail in that first chapter, but I'm chronicling many of the parallels between those two scenes, and I'm presenting evidence for this whole acid house scene as having been, if not created, then at least co-opted and hijacked by the military intelligence services, probably MI5, MI6, and then you'd have agencies like the Tavistock Institute having their hand in it as well, and just ensuring that youth culture got changed in line with certain templates and certain plans, and this would have been paving the way for what was known to be coming in the 3 decades ahead, which brings us all the way up to 2018 and what we have now, with the massive worldwide dance music scene going in hand with transhumanism very much and AI futurism. This is where we get into chapter 2 with electronic evangelism, and I'm talking about how the dance music scene now is being used very much to push transhumanist ideas in line with the kind of spiritual ethos of the dark controllers that we have, who are basically occultists, as we discussed last time round. So, yeah, some very deep and complex subjects, but I really wanted to kick off with this because it's the 30-year point for Acid House, and I've not heard any other author, researcher or commentator asking questions about how genuine and grassroots the UK acid house scene was versus whether it was, steered off in certain desired directions. Nobody else has asked these questions, so somebody had to do it.
It doesn't get any more detailed than that. Boy, Mark. And that's just chapter 1, huh? You did touch a little bit on chapter 2, electronic evangelism, electronic dance music. And that tied in a little bit with chapter 1, mind control and social engineering, when you mentioned Tavistock. So you think you got both chapters in that, or do you want to touch on chapter 2 a little?
Well, those two are very much related, and you should certainly read and absorb one in conjunction with the other, because it's a very vast story. But in chapter 2, I'm going into some of the themes, some of the imagery, and some of the naming of these big dance music festivals that we now have. I am drawing attention to certain key figures in this chapter who really seem to be chosen ones in terms of leading this whole scene. One of them is Paul van Dyk, who's a German DJ and producer. And it's very interesting to chart his career development over the past few years. You often find with many celebrities and famous people, there's a point in their career where it just seems to go through the roof stratospheric. And however successful they may have been before, suddenly now they just reach new phenomenal levels. And it really smacks of them being given a helping hand up the ladder of success by those that can make these things happen. So with Van Dyke, you can certainly chart that back a few years, to the point that now he's playing a whole bunch of festivals every year all over the world, massive events in sports stadiums and arenas where you get hundreds of thousands of people at a time. And when you look at the imagery involved and the naming of some of these events, like I said, it absolutely harks back to pushing transhumanist, futurist AI ideas into the consciousness of these young people that go to these events. So some of the names, we've got Dream State in California, Trance Nation and Luminosity in the Netherlands, Velvet Hypnotized in Bali, Atlantis in Australia, Spring Awakening in Chicago, Awake in Dresden, Awakening Fridays in LA, Dream Beach in Spain, Digital Dreams, Future Music Festival, New Horizons, Global Dance, Global Clubbing Nation. You know I love those two, right? So it's all about ideas of expanding consciousness, of awakening, new levels of understanding, but not in the way that we cover on these podcasts. I would suggest that these events are tapping into the collective consciousness of the assembled throngs of clubbers and implanting certain ideas into their mind states through these altered chemical states in which they find themselves. So it would be no coincidence that these big events are going hand in hand with the consumption of E and other psychedelic drugs, which is literally rewiring the consciousness of the people that are being exposed to this stuff. Then, of course, you've got the fact that the nature of all this dance music now is digital, electronic, and that's another thing that's hinted at by all the names of these events. So you're not getting music delivered in an organic form. It's not music that's been created by musicians on instruments. It's music that's been created on computers. And where you get digital files and things like that, you have all kinds of opportunities to manipulate what is going into the frequencies and the makeup of these files. So when you've got large numbers of people all pooling their consciousness and being exposed to all these signs and symbols and sigils which are being flashed up at these events, because that's another big part of it, all these familiar signs and symbols that we came across in Volume 1, you see on these massive screens. So you combine the drug taking, which is rewiring the brains of these kids, with what could be going into the sound frequencies. And I've got many former ravers' comments in this chapter where they're speculating on what could have been happening to them for all these years that they were going clubbing and taking drugs and being exposed to all this stuff. So, there's a number of people that used to be susceptible to all of this that are now able to see it for what it is with the benefit of hindsight and the passing of time. So I'm chronicling all of that and just, again, asking questions that nobody else is asking about the true nature of these events and what the combined effects could be of drugs, dark occult symbology, and sound frequencies. That's the basis of Chapter 2. All
right. Listening to you reminded me of about 7 or 8 years ago when I went to Burning Man, and that was the general vibe over there. All through the night was electronic dance music just bumping all over the place. So that was another area where this is all focused.
Oh, well, I didn't know you'd been to Burning Man. I've got some comments about Burning Man in the book from Steve Altrim. I know you'll be familiar with Steve from him having guested on Jan Irvin's Gnostic Media podcast, but Steve has the website burners.me, which is the most comprehensive site on the net, asking about the nefarious side of Burning Man and investigating what it could really be all about. So that's quite a fascinating one to get into. I didn't know you'd been to that.
Yeah, it's been quite a few years now. Only that one time, though. Okay, so let's move on to Chapter 3, Fool Me Once. And this is about, again, social engineering, the culture creation, and lifetime actors.
Well, I would say that this is probably the most important chapter in the book. with the exception of the final chapter where I sum everything up like I did with Volume 1. But in terms of the regular chapters, if people only have time to read and fully absorb and fully understand one, this would be the one that I would point them to. And this has been the basis of a few talks that I gave in 2017, and it's going to be the basis of the talk that I give at your conference, Ivan, Truth, Mind, Reality, in March in Phoenix, all about lifetime actors, culture creation, social engineering, how that all gets done. It's very important for people to understand that anyone who is placed in the public eye in any kind of position to the point that they're a household name and people have heard of them will have been either placed there right from the start in order to have a controlling effect on the people that are exposed to their work, or there'll be a point in their career where they achieved a certain level of success under their own steam, and this had come to the attention of those that like to control such situations, and it was at that point that their career was co-opted and they were brought into the club, so to speak, and from that point on everything that they did publicly would have been according to some agenda or other. And, I've listened to a lot of podcasts of Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill on Gnostic Media over the past year or so, and anyone that has heard their programs will be aware that they get into this stuff big time. And there were certain points where I would hear them exposing some consciousness guru or some public figure or other, and I would think, oh, God, not them as well. Where does this stop? And there were certain points where I thought, oh, Jan takes it too far, it can't be everyone. But when you really get into the research and when you really look at the backgrounds and the patterns and the trends that start to emerge, you come to realise that there probably really are no exceptions when it comes to very famous people in very influential positions. Because those that are unfortunately controlling this world of ours would not leave it to chance which individuals rise to those hugely influential positions. They would want to be in control of that whole process. So I'm breaking down what lifetime actors are, which is people that you've heard of, people whose names you know, and you think of them as a famous politician or an actor or a musician, big time, or a dance music producer even. But when you get into their family bloodlines, which is key to so much, looking at who their fathers were, who their grandfathers were, going back in the ancestry tells you so much, and you start to notice all these patterns forming. Then you look at some of the affiliations that they have. Yale and Harvard universities, it can be Skull and Bones, the Bohemian Club, connections to the Fabian Society, the Tavistock Institute, connections to the Church of Satan and other dark occult groups. And you start to think, well, hang on a minute, it's turning out that anyone in any kind of position like this has some sort of connection like this. So it's pretty clear how they got to that influential position. So I'm breaking down not just familiar musicians, but, other people that you would know of in the public eye, and just going into some of those background connections. It tells you so much.
All right, so then that takes us to Chapter 4, and I'm not figuring out this title very well. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? And then good night, exclamation. So what's this all about?
All right, well, the title is a reference to a comment that Johnny Rotten made at the final Sex Pistols gig in January 1978 in San Francisco. The last Beatles gig was in San Francisco as well, so I don't know what it is about that city that tends to shut groups' touring careers down. But anyway, at the end of this concert, Johnny Rotten just got up on stage and said, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night." And it seemed to be almost an admission on his part that the Sex Pistols had been very much contrived and very much manufactured and weren't necessarily the organic punk band that everyone liked to think of them as in their heyday. You got Malcolm McLaren, the brainchild behind the Sex Pistols, and you've got connections between McLaren and lots of other unsavoury characters, and not least this movement, a sort of avant-garde intellectual movement called Situationist International, which itself has all kinds of other affiliations and connections. And that was very much tied into the punk scene, coming out of both the UK and the US, which sort of developed simultaneously. The scene coming out of New York, and particularly the Village, Greenwich Village area, preceded the UK scene by a few years. But very soon you had the punk scene coming out of London, and so many connections and overlaps between what had happened in the US. So the title of the chapter is just kind of implying that there's way more to know about where punk and new wave came from than, again, first meets the eye. And I'm detailing a whole load of connections kind of dovetailing back into Chapter 3 and Lifetime Actors, with some of punk and new wave's key players, some of the band members and some of the managers. So again, we're going into dark occult groups, we're going into Ivy League connections, Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Columbia and Berkeley and Oxford and Cambridge universities, connections going into the Tavistock Institute again. There's even connections with serial killers. The whole thing is just ridiculous. There's connections going back to American presidents. And the thing about the punk and new wave scene is when you think of these bands playing their gigs, they're in these dirty, dingy, gritty, shitty sort of spit and sawdust type venues, all grungy and dark and people spitting and all this kind of thing. You would imagine that people that gravitated towards that kind of musical career would come from very working class backgrounds. And when you started looking at the dads of these people, I personally would expect the dads to be things like construction workers, lorry drivers, that kind of thing, dock workers, miners, that sort of thing. So why is it that you find dads who are foreign diplomats, government officials, spokespeople for political parties, spokespeople for American presidents in some cases, university lecturers, designers of things like the Louvre Pyramid in France and other Illuminati-type architecture around the world? That's not something you would naturally expect to find. So I'm someone that looks at patterns and looks at trends and asks questions as to why this should be. And I had many questions about why it was that all these punk and new wave musicians had these kind of connections. Basically, what it boils down to is that whole genre, much as fans of it will hate to hear it, because they always do, being contrived and being manufactured in just the same way as so many others were. Over the course of these two books, I've covered electronic dance music, I've covered hip-hop, I've covered psychedelic rock, I've covered punk and new wave here, I get into heavy metal as well, and it just turns out that in every scene you might care to look at, the key players have all these kind of dubious connections. So I'm making the point in this book, and in the public talks that I'll be doing this year, that we need to stop having these heroes. We need to stop looking up to these people. No more heroes, because we don't really know these people. You might think you do, but you're going by their public persona. You're going by what newspaper articles and magazine interviews have told you, and what you see on TV, and the impression you get of them from their gigs and listening to their records. You don't really know who these people are. So no more heroes. We've got to stop externalizing our power to these people. That's not to say, let me throw this in as a caveat, that's not to say that you should stop enjoying the music. I want to make this very clear. I'm not someone that endorses throwing out all your old albums and never listening to these artists again. We need music, and a lot of the music that these Lifetime actors make is great music. There's no getting away from it. So absolutely, you can continue to rock out to these tunes. I'm just asking people to be consciously aware of who these people really are or really could be. And once you get that kind of awareness into the conscious mind, these groups, these acts, are no longer having the controlling effect on you that they once did on a subliminal, unseen level. It's all about getting it into the conscious mind. But absolutely, continue to enjoy the music. That's a very important message. But that's what that one's all about, man.
Oh, man. Wow. You got me kind of with my jaw dropped. Once you cleared up the title, what that meant, I got into it. I was like, aha. And one particular name came to mind for me personally, and you don't have to go all in depth on it, but Billy Idol sprung to mind, because when I was around 10 years old, 1980, 81, I had Billy Idol albums. Do I need to worry about Billy Idol?
Interesting. Yeah, I used to like Billy Idol myself as well. But I do mention him in that chapter. He popped up at an event with Timothy Leary, doing a talk with Leary. And there's also an interview that I reference where he seems to be espousing transhumanist ideas as well. He's talking about kind of AI future. So, old Billy would appear to be down with the clique as well.
Yeah, I figured as much. It was a 90s album, Cyberpunk, that he was talking. The whole album was done via computer generation. Okay, well, in that last chapter, you did drop the word heavy metal, and that goes into chapter 5, heavy vibes. So heavy metal and Satanism, chapter 5. What's this about?
Yeah, well, this was a chapter that I was a bit reluctant to get into, mainly because I didn't know very much about heavy metal and heavy rock. That's never been my preferred area of music, and I felt myself to be pretty uninformed about it. But I had a lot of requests from readers of my work to cover this one, and people were saying you really should look into it. So I kind of decided it was a responsibility I needed to take on. And it turned out to be very interesting, and I'm really glad that I got it in there. I consulted quite a few people who did know the heavy metal genre very well and asked for their views on what it was all about, because I make the point that if you mention Satanism in music to the average person in the street, I think their mind would go straight to heavy rock and heavy metal, more so than any other genre. So they're going to conjure up images of rockers flashing up the Baphomet horned hand sign, which has become synonymous with heavy metal. And it was popularised by Ronnie James Dio of Black Sabbath initially. He seems to be the guy that put it on the map. But many other rockers, of course, have adopted it, and the fans all throw this sign up at concerts. And it is linked in occult research with, various rituals that these dark occult groups employ, and it's kind of a motif of them. So that becomes interesting in itself. Then you look at the subject matter and the lyricism of many heavy metal records and the naming of bands, Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax, and all the rest of them. And it all conjures up images of gore and death and destruction. And so the question becomes, how much of this is contrived, how much of it is being done for shock value and controversy, and how many of these acts are just doing it in full knowledge that it's going to get them noticed and get them talked about, and they're going to get put on the map that way, versus how much of it is genuine, and how many of these acts really are into these kind of practices and these kinds of ideas, and they're using the music as a vehicle for it. So I had a few apologists for heavy metal that were saying, oh, of course it's all contrived, man. You can see it's all an act. These groups are just having a laugh. Ozzy Osbourne, these stories of him biting a dove's head off and all this kind of stuff. It's just to generate shock headlines. But then you have other people that will tell you that many of these acts really do believe these dark occult ritualistic practices that they employ, and that the music is indeed being used as a vehicle to get that stuff into the consciousness of the public. So I go right back to the late 1960s to a band called Coven, where you've got the front woman known as Jinx Dawson, and she details where it is she came from in terms of her family bloodline. And I quote her in the book. It's coming straight from the horse's mouth. There's no need for any wild speculation there. She's talking about how she hails from a family of witches, occultists going back centuries. And so that got me thinking, well, why would she have chosen a career as the front woman for a rock band? It wasn't heavy metal as such. This was more kind of psychedelic rock from the late 60s. Why would she have chosen that path versus becoming a ceremonial magician or something like that? And you come to realise that there's very little distance between those two things. The lines are blurred between what is perceived to be performance art and what is genuine dark occult ritual practice. So again, you've got to ask yourself what effect some of these stage shows and some of the lyrics going into these songs and the structure of the music itself could be having on the consciousness of those that listen to it. And like I say, it's a battle between those that would apologise for this genre and say it's harmless, and others who would say, no, there's definitely something going on here. I end that chapter by going into the Norwegian death metal scene, which I don't think anyone could apologise for that. It's as dark as it's possible to get. All this music, so-called, is about death, destruction, annihilation, nihilism, mutilation. That's the subject matter of this entire genre. And when it first emerged in the 90s, it was linked with a series of church burnings across Norway. That's where this music comes out of. And many of the prominent acts in this scene were implicated in the burning of Christian churches. They made the point, those that gave public comments, that they were trying to hark back to the pagan roots, Norwegian pagan roots before Christianity came in, and they were making that kind of statement through their music. I detail a horrific incident involving these two members of Norwegian black metal groups that ended in really horrific, grisly murders at the very end of the chapter. And I kind of leave it at that just to make the point that I don't think music can be entirely innocent of such things, and I think that groups do have a responsibility for the sort of stuff that they put into their sounds, and it does have an effect on the morphogenic field, I guess, in terms of the energy that's being put out there. Music is very powerful in that way, and I don't think you can write it off as just harmless and nothing to worry about. I'm just giving some examples of why, with this genre in particular, I think there's some stuff that people need to pay attention to. Also in that chapter, I'm talking about some real-life events which took place involving young people going out and committing murder or committing suicide, and stating, for the record, that listening to heavy metal music made them do it, in their words. So, there have been some very real, very tangible cases of that kind of activity that has been linked closely to this music.
Wow. As you speak about each chapter, I go ahead and read the title for the following chapter just to kind of get my mindset ready. And while you were speaking on this past chapter, Heavy Vibes, I was looking at the next chapter and thinking, man, the next chapter goes off in a totally different direction. That's kind of no connection here. Okay. But you did mention one word in chapter 5, describing it, that now makes me realize how it ties in. Magical. And magic is a science that's not understood. So chapter 6 is cymatics and the science of sound. So now that makes perfect sense why that would follow that chapter on heavy metal. So get into that chapter 6.
Yeah, this is another one that I was a little reluctant to get into, and for the same reason, really. I didn't know that much about it. I wasn't particularly well informed. I'm not a very technical guy, which surprises people. I'm not really up on sound technology and production and things like that. I'm a music man. I love music. I love listening to music and putting it out there. But in terms of how it's created, I really struggle to understand that sometimes. So this was a real heavy area of research for me, getting familiar with the whole science of sound and how sound frequencies work. So I'm detailing some of my findings here. Of course, I had to cover the 432 versus 440 Hertz question, because that always comes up in these kind of discussions, and I make the point that that is the question I've had since I started doing this type of research more than any other at talks and such. When it's opened up to Q&A, people always say, what do you think about 432 and 440 Hertz? So I'm getting into that whole thing and how the frequency at which music is recorded and mastered can have an effect on the consciousness and the body rhythms and the whole energy of those that end up listening to the music. I'm picking up on comments from this guy, John Todd, who was a music industry insider in the 1970s. He was also an occultist, a witch that came from a long-running bloodline that was put to use in the American music industry. And I mentioned some of his comments in Volume 1, where he talked about hexes and spells that were put on master tapes of recordings before they got put out into the market by the record companies. There's quite a few occasions in this book where I pick up on those comments and ask whether that whole process could have been updated in these times, now that we have digital electronic files and our music is delivered in that way. If they were putting hexes from witches on recording tape back in the 1970s, and the same groups and agencies and individuals are still controlling the industry, what do we think they might be doing with sound frequencies in electronic files now? I'm talking about the tritone, what's known as the diabolic tritone or the devil's interval, that goes right back to the days of classical music, the classical music greats of several hundred years ago. In some of these symphonies, there was employed what was known as the tritone, and it was supposed to have a very discordant, very shocking, jarring effect on the consciousness of the listener when they were exposed to these three tones played in rapid succession. This was, 500 years ago. This was being spoken about as having a dissonant effect on the listener. So again, what could be going on now? How could that whole thing have been updated in these times? And I'm talking about sawtooth waves, and they're supposed to be very discordant in the same way again. So really getting into the whole area of sound and cymatics. And of course, sound is used for healing. When you get a very harmonic frequency such as 432 or 528, which is known as the love frequency, and I'm quoting Dr. Len Horowitz and all his work on love 528 in this chapter. When you're exposed to these good frequencies or good vibrations, may I say, it can have a healing and very calming effect on human minds and human bodies. There are therapy centers that use sound to treat things like depression and anxiety and all kinds of medical conditions, and sound has been proven to be of great value in these areas. But in the same way that it can be used for healing when it's in the hands of an experienced practitioner with benevolent aims in mind, of course the opposite is true. you can always invert any kind of situation. And so if sound is put into the hands of individuals and groups that don't have humanity's best interests at heart, and they want to use it to cause harm, of course it can be used for those purposes. And there are many examples within the corporate music industry of where that kind of practice has been employed. So that's what I'm discussing here.
Wow. Now listening to you explain that, there were two different things that bounced through my head, and they were movie related. When you talked about the dark side of frequencies, I kept thinking about the music, that classical music that was used in The Shining, that low tone, that song, dun, 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 dun. It's like very eerie. And then I thought, what's the opposite of that? And the opposite of that are like the higher pitch, more happier songs, like the theme for like E.T. or Close Encounters. It's like, yay, everything's fine, everything's happy ending. And I thought, wow, that's a perfect example of frequencies and how they can affect you,
And also in Eyes Wide Shut, where you've got, that very disturbing sort of tone that keeps getting repeated in the ritual there that Tom Cruise stumbles across in the mansion. There's something about that sound that doesn't sound good, man. That just puts me on edge every time I hear that. It's disturbing.
Right. And then now that leads into chapter 7, because like you said, everything can be inverted, even though it's not the frequencies. But chapter 7 is nothing sacred. And I guess this is about going back to hip hop. So what's this about?
I've called it Is Nothing Sacred because of all the music genres that I cover, the one that's closest to my heart is hip-hop, because that's my main area of interest, my chosen genre. For many years, I was a DJ out there playing hip-hop tunes and doing it on the radio as well. 90s hip-hop, coming out of primarily New York and a few other places, was just some of the best music ever. Those really were the golden years for that genre. 93, 94, 95, I would say. Just incredible output. And I just loved that whole scene. I knew a lot about the key players in it. I knew a lot about the DJs and the producers and the lifestyles that went with it. And I also knew a lot about hip-hop's history, how it grew up out of the South Bronx, the street parties, the block parties that used to occur, and how graffiti went hand in hand with the b-boy and the dancing, turntablism, guys like Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash that kicked off the whole scene. And I always considered it to be a very pure, organic art form. I considered it to be very worthwhile in that it prevented many young males from going off into potential lives of crime. Instead, they channeled all their energy and all their input into the hip-hop scene and created something that was beautiful and positive versus what could otherwise have been the case. That had always been my view of what hip-hop was all about. So it's been very tragic and very distressing for me to see where that whole scene has gone in the past few years, to the point that you now have guys like Lil Wayne and Rick Ross and Drake and groups like Migos being hailed as heroes and being hailed as these great MCs and these wonderful artists, and the sort of stuff that Kanye West has been putting out in the last few years, which is just utterly degraded and debased in my view. And the production styles of so-called hip-hop now, I mean, it doesn't even deserve to be called hip-hop in terms of the lack of relationship that it has to what went before it. The production styles that are going into these records that you hear played now on stations like One Extra and Capital Extra here in the UK, and I'm sure it's the case with Hot 97 and all these other hip-hop stations in the US, it's just straight up satanic in terms of the frequencies that are being used in the productions, the sort of stuff that's going into the lyrics. It's anti-creation, anti-everything that's natural, anti-everything that's positive. So I'm going off on a bit of a rant here. But that was my view of where hip-hop has gone and how corrupted it's become. But I've now had to start asking some very reluctant questions about how organic and pure it might really have been right from the start, and whether I've fallen for yet another sort of glossy cover story and Wikipedia version of events where the truth of the matter might be a little bit more sinister. And the thing that got me thinking along those lines was the incident that we had almost 2 years ago in spring 2016, when you had a couple of guys who were former members of the Universal Zulu Nation, which is this group that was created by Afrika Bambaataa back in the 1970s, and it's always been spoken about with great reverence and great importance in terms of being a big part of hip-hop culture and how it all developed. So these two guys emerged simultaneously accusing Afrika Bambaataa of having sexually molested them on an ongoing basis when they were young teenagers, dating back to the late 1970s, early 1980s. And in the wake of that, a couple of other individuals came forward as well with similar claims, and that opened up a whole can of worms in terms of various members of the Zulu Nation, various other rappers, various other prominent figures on the hip-hop scene, all chiming in with something to say about the situation. It's left Afrika Bambaataa not looking too great. He's been accused of having been a predatory sexual paedophile by many people now, and he's not sufficiently been able to defend these claims. The Universal Zulu Nation is actually on record as having apologised for his paedophilic behaviour, so that's almost an admission on their part that that's what he was all about. And when you look back to the early days of the Zulu Nation with this in mind, you've got to ask yourself what the true nature of that organisation may have been. It took a whole load of young males off the streets in the ghetto, in the hood, and kind of inducted them into this group situation. But it was all about communal living, and it was all about different members of the same family being brought into the fold, and it was all about members being encouraged to only fraternise with each other and not kind of socialise with anyone outside of the group. And what does that type of setup remind you of when you've done the research? A cult, right? Those are all the hallmarks of a mind control cult. And these are questions now that any serious researcher who wants to get to the truth of a matter needs to ask themselves about what the Universal Zulu Nation might have been all about. I'm anticipating very much the release of a documentary this year by a lady called Layla Wills, who's a journalist for the Metropolis newspaper in Chicago. And she's been all over this story since it first broke. She's done a whole load of interviews. She's spoken to people that knew Bambaataa in the early days. All kinds of questions about him. He's on record as his real name having been Kevin Donovan, but there's also evidence to suggest that his real name may have been Lance Taylor. And he's been known by other names as well, so we don't really know who this guy is. His mother and his uncle are said to have been political activists, but you've got to ask yourself again how this guy came to wield so much power over the Universal Zulu Nation, which evolved out of this group called the Black Spades back in 1973, when he was only 16 years of age. Where do you get that kind of power and influence if you're not getting some kind of assistance from outside sources? So this lady, Layla Wills, has got a documentary forthcoming later this year. It's going to be called Trapped in a Culture, with a reference on the letters rap cult, because she's also of the view that the Zulu Nation was actually some kind of cult. And it was used to make sure that the whole hip-hop scene and hip-hop culture went off in a desired direction rather than evolving on its own. Where have we come across a scenario like that before? So this is what's so devastating for me. I'm having to acknowledge that this whole scene may be, controlled in exactly the same way as so many others are. Then you've got to factor in the influence of the 5% Nation, 5%ers, which is a sort of faction, an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, which was the organisation attended by Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad back in the day, and Muhammad Ali, the boxer, got involved in that organisation as well. And coming all the way forward to present day, the Nation of Islam, particularly the 5% Nation spin-off of it, has a major effect on hip-hop. There are so many rappers who espouse its teachings and will say that they're a member of this kind of organisation. So here we have a religious movement going hand in hand with what certainly appears to be a cult-type community, absolutely pervading the ranks of hip-hop's big names. So there are some reluctant questions to be asked, but I'm asking them in this chapter.
Man, again, listening to you speak, it reminded me of my youth. As you know, I was raised in the Bronx. Yeah, and I remember 139th Street, Cypress, St. Anne's area. I lived on the second floor, and I would be looking out the window, and my apartment, the window was right above where the parking structure was at, so the driveway was real, big. And I remember seeing the local guys throw down some cardboards and take the boombox and start playing the hip-hop music, and they'd be breakdancing right in the front. So I'm like, man, wow, I remember this stuff when it was starting. And to think that it might have been a manipulation either from the inception, somewhere in the middle, or towards the end, it's kind of mind-boggling, that to think that somebody has that kind of mentality to corrupt something, that looks so innocent and pure, and now you got to question, was it all, alive from the beginning,
Yeah. Did you know any Zulu Nation members?
No, my father really protected me, so I was, pretty nerdy kind of guy, but, I'd be looking out the window and see all this stuff, but I never really interacted with anyone, but I was around it, but not in it. So
all right.
Something else you dropped during this chapter description, you asked the question, we don't know who Africa Bambaataa is. Who's this guy? What's his real name?
Right.
And if you want to keep moving forward, chapter 8 is Paul, another person. Who is this guy? What is his real name?
Yeah. No more heroes. We don't really know these people. We think we do, but do we really? So yeah, it's a good segue into chapter 8. I'm revisiting the whole Paul McCartney mess, the McCartney mindfuck, as I call it. And really, Ivan, this stands as a good example of the way we evolve, or probably should evolve, as truth seekers. Because my position on the whole McCartney thing now is different to the position that I took in Musical Truth 1. What I put into that book is where I was at with this whole thing, based on the research that I had done, based on where I was at the time in 2016. But here we are 2 years later, and I've moved on quite a bit since then. I've looked at a lot of material, I've considered a lot of different viewpoints, and whereas previously I would have told you the real Paul McCartney died and was replaced, and the guy that we have in the world today claiming to be Paul McCartney ain't the real guy, I used to say that with some certainty because I thought all the evidence backed this up. I would look at photographs and video footage and I was seeing two different people. It can't possibly be the same man. So I bought into this whole myth that there is, this whole legend within truth and conspiracy research circles, which is known as PID, Paul is dead. And it states that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966. He was replaced by an imposter who's been taking his place to this day. And the Beatles and those controlling them placed a whole load of visual and symbolic clues into their album sleeves and in photographs and comments made in interviews and in audio recordings, backmasked and things like that, to let people know what had gone on, albeit in a very cryptic way. So, as I say, I've looked at all kinds of different viewpoints on this, and now you don't find me saying the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced, because there actually is no definitive evidence to show or to prove that Paul McCartney died in 1966. All there is symbolic clues. Well, symbolic clues can be interpreted in many different ways. They don't have to be interpreted literally, and one person's interpretation could differ from the next person's. So, like I say, we have no definitive evidence that he died. I still maintain that there has been more than one Paul McCartney, and that's the thing that I remain certain of. So, Paul was replaced. It's not that Paul is dead. It's that Paul was replaced, or Paul ain't Paul. And what I'm doing in this chapter is examining a couple of alternative theories on this whole thing. So I've got this woman, Ellen Rain, who I featured on one of my podcast interviews a few months ago. She's also changed her standpoint, actually, in more recent times, since I wrote the chapter. And like I say, this is an example of what we should be willing to do. You shouldn't just nail your colours to a mast in terms of this is what I believe about this subject and I'm never going to change. If new information comes along, you've got to be prepared to say, I was mistaken. I got it wrong, now this is how I see it. And people that can do that get my respect, big time, versus those that cling to a theory and never budge from it because their ego won't allow them to acknowledge that they could have been duped or mistaken. So Ellen brought my attention to the idea that the real Paul didn't die, but he was kind of shuffled off the scene at some point, and his replacement was brought in to play the Paul role. But there have been various points along the way where the original Paul has been brought back into the public scene in the odd video, the odd interview, the odd performance. And what we've seen over the years is the real Paul alongside whoever this other individual is. whether it's William Shepard, Billy Shears, or any other name that's come up in research over the years. So that's one theory. And I've kind of juxtaposed that with another theory, but in actual fact, these two are mutually compatible, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. So the other theory comes from a guy called Miles Mathis, who's a painter, not a painter or a decorator, but an artist, And he's also got a sideline as a conspiracy researcher. He's revisited a whole load of events that have happened over the past several decades, and he's taken a very razor-sharp eye to the imagery involved. He says his artist's eye allows him to notice things that other people miss, and so he's asked whether the official version of these events is true or whether we've been lied to and bamboozled all these years. I've got to say, I don't go along with everything that he claims. I don't agree with all the findings that you'll see on his website, milesmathis.com. You can download documents of all his findings on there. But when it comes to McCartney, he claims that the key to this whole puzzle is really very simple. What we've been looking at all these years is twins. Paul McCartney was one of twins. And what they've done is they've just shuffled in each twin from time to time into the public role as, in inverted commas, Paul. Both of them have played the role of Paul. And so the controllers behind this scenario have not been honest with us by telling us we're looking at two different people, but he claims that's what it is. And actually, like I say, this theory is compatible with Ellen's, that Paul didn't die, he just went away for a time and he's been brought back from time to time. So we're left with not knowing whether the individual we've got today is in fact the real Paul McCartney or the replacement. It seems to me that it could be either. Maybe we've been looking at the one that we've always thought of as Paul, and he is in fact the other guy. And the one that we now think of as Paul or Billy or whatever, could he be the real Paul? The whole thing is such a mess that we just don't know. But Mathis makes the point that military intelligence has always loved twins. They love recruiting twins. They've used them in mind control experiments, such as the Cray twins, the notorious London gangsters in the 60s. And they've been used in surveillance and subterfuge type assignments because twins are very useful in throwing people off the track and using doubles and things like that. So he makes the point that, in line with many other researchers who think the Beatles were the product of military intelligence, or at least they had some hand in their career, we could well have been looking at twins all these years. So isn't that an interesting slant to put on the whole thing? And that's what's explored in this chapter. That's somewhere I've never been before, but it's somewhere that makes a whole lot of sense to me now.
Huh. And now I see the title in a different way. It's Paul. You got two Pauls there.
Exactly. Which is which?
Wow. But here's one thing.
Let me just say, though, sorry, I forgot to get in there. A lot of researchers agree that, in actual fact, I mean, if you thought that was a mindfuck, if you thought that was confusing, wait for this. There have actually been more than just those two. And you get this from looking at photos. When you look at the vast array of photos of a Paul McCartney that are available on the internet, and you really scrutinise every one, and you look at facial structure, the shape of the nose is very key to it, the colour of the eyes, the height, all kinds of other body features, moles, scars. It seems to be that there were more than two. So there have been two main guys that have played the role, but there have been others. There's been more than two, and at various points you've had other people that appear to have been playing the role of Paul McCartney. I know that sounds crazy. I know it's too much for people, but you've got to look at it with an open mind. You've got to look at it from the point of view of forensics and just be really honest with yourself in looking at these pictures. There are some montages that people have put together of all these different McCartneys, and it just seems like there's a factory somewhere and there's a conveyor belt that's just churning out Pauls. Like a full factory. There's just so goddamn many of them. It's a mess, mate. It really is.
Wow, yeah. But in reality, when we're dealing with conspiracy, quote unquote, that shouldn't come as a surprise when we think of Saddam Hussein lookalikes or fill-ins. We think of crisis actors and everything. So why not something this huge? Why wouldn't they have a few people on the side just in case?
Well, that's right.
Yeah, but here's one thing we do know. Moving on to chapter 9, if Paul is not dead, we I guess, can say these next two people, or we've been told they died. And so the name of chapter 9, so it's Good Night from me and it's Good Night from him. And this deals with the deaths of Prince and George Michael.
Well, I should probably quantify the title of this chapter, which probably won't make sense to American listeners. It will definitely make sense to anyone from Britain, because it was the catchphrase of the two Ronnies, this comedy duo that were on TV in the 70s and 80s. They used to finish the show by, one of them would say, it's good night from me, and the other one would say, it's good night from him. So I just used that as a kind of quip, as a funny title for this one. So it's all about the reported deaths of Prince and George Michael. I say reported because you can never really be sure of anything. I do personally feel that both these guys have checked out. That's my inklings on it. I know there's lots of people that say celebrity deaths are hoaxed. Maybe they are, maybe some are, but my feeling in this case is that both these guys left us in very suspicious circumstances, shall we say. And the reason they're suspicious is because of all the little clues and indicators and predictive programming type suggestions that were planted in popular culture in the months leading up to their deaths. I mean, the George Michael one is a classic. So in this chapter, I'm detailing the ridiculous amount of references to George Michael, George Michael's music, and the idea of George Michael being dead that appeared in movies and TV shows and soap operas in the months leading up to his announced death on Christmas Day of 2016. And there were even two shows that went out on British TV about half an hour before his death was announced on the news. And both of them had references to George Michael, specifically Last Christmas. Isn't it interesting that a man most famous for the song Last Christmas I Gave You My Heart just happens to die on Christmas Day of reported heart failure? So I'm going into all of that. There's lots of questions about this guy that was named as his boyfriend, Fadi Fawaz. Lots of stuff about that guy just doesn't add up. The story that he gave to police about how he came to discover George's body changed, so he gave two different versions of his account. Now, if you or I had done that, I think we would have spent a night in the cells at the very least. But he evidently had no such problems with changing his story. And we must ask ourselves who he really is. Was he really his partner? Or could he have been some kind of mind control handler? Then you get on to Prince, and there's all kinds of strange stuff leading up to his reported death. That coincided with the 90th birthday of the Queen of England. Well, Germany, but you know what I mean. And there was this incident where you had Niagara Falls being lit up in purple on the day that his death was announced. And there's all these other kind of strange phenomena that were going on as well. So you have the death of Prince on the birthday of the Queen. Coincidence? Or is there some veiled symbology and occultic stuff going on here? So these are questions that I'm asking with these two, and I'm just detailing some of the strange stuff surrounding their reported deaths.
And both those artists were really huge in the 80s, and that ties into the next chapter, Same Shit, Different Decade, and that decodes 80s pop videos.
Yeah, you're segueing better than me here. This is a kind of wild and disparate chapter, but it's one I really wanted to put in there because I spent some time looking at all the motifs and the little icons and the little calling cards of the Illuminati, so-called, that was going into current day pop videos. So the likes of Miley Cyrus and Kesha and Rihanna, Beyonce, Kanye West, all these types of individuals, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga. And, it's the Baphomet horned hand sign, it's black and white, Masonic checkerboard duality, it's shattered mirrors, it's the one eye, the covering of one eye, pyramids everywhere. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see whether all this stuff crops up in videos from decades ago? I've never actually looked to see if it does. So I went on YouTube, looked at a whole load of 1980s pop videos, all this music that I grew up with that I loved back in the day. And what do you know? It's all there. I wondered if it was, and it was. You have exactly the same motifs cropping up in videos from the likes of Duran Duran, Adam and the Ants, Kim Wilde, Toya Wilcox, Ultravox, Visage, Eurythmics, David Bowie, all these different groups. And so I'm going video by video and just taking people through some of the stuff that they can expect to see. And the great thing about it is anyone can check these videos out for themselves. All you got to do is go on YouTube and they're all there. And you get loads of hints at trauma-based mind control, Monarch programming, MK Ultra, all of that. You get loads of Masonic stuff, Kabbalistic stuff, dark occult imagery, all the pyramids, all the all-seeing eyes. It's all there. So all these acts in the 1980s and all these video directors were putting all the same stuff into these videos that were having this controlling subliminal effect on the viewing public. And back then, of course, nobody knew what to look for. There was no internet. Nobody was talking about this. Nobody was sharing this information. So this stuff really was getting lapped up by the masses, the collective consciousness. Now we know more what to look for and we can be a bit more alert. But back then, people didn't stand a chance. So this was a really interesting one, and in my upcoming talks this year, I'll be showing a few visuals from some of these videos so people can see for themselves what was going into our minds 30-odd years ago.
Wow. And I think that pretty much then wraps up the book as far as the information that people don't know about. And then your final chapter is waiting to be written. And I guess that's for everyone who's read these books or heard them on audio, and that puts the responsibility on their shoulders. What happens next? And I skipped ahead and read the last few paragraphs of the book and noticed that you put in a little thing of Tina Turner's song from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, We Don't Need Another Hero. So how does all this come together, Mark?
That's right. She says in those lyrics, the last generation, we are the last generation. And we really are, because when all is said and done and you've absorbed all this kind of information, what do we then do with it? Do you think to yourself, oh, that's interesting, I feel so much more informed now? Or do we resolve to take some personal responsibility for this fucked up situation that humanity is currently in? Now, this ties in very much with what Mark Passio had to say on the podcast that he did with you the other week. So I'd certainly guide people towards that. It's obviously an angry rant from Mark, but I understand why he felt motivated to talk like that. And in my final chapter, I am making the point that, as I've heard him say on many occasions, what researchers like us want to hear from people is not, oh, this was all really interesting, thanks, I've learnt so much more now. But this was really interesting, thank you for your contribution. I now understand that I have to get involved myself and make my own personal participation in the process that needs to take place. So nobody can come away from reading these books not realising that we are being ruled over by a bunch of dark occult psychotic maniacs that want to destroy humanity and want us all in perpetual slavery. That is bad news for anyone. It's particularly bad news for anyone that has kids that are going to have to grow up in this nightmare that is unfolding around us. And there's so many facets to it. What I talk about with the music industry is just one small part of what's going on. And anyone who's remotely awake and aware and paying attention will already know that. But for as long as people just sit around saying, oh, this is interesting, yeah, I'm very informed, I know all about chemtrails and vaccines and false flag terror events. Yeah, it's great that you know, but now you've got to do something with it. Because with truth, with an understanding of truth, comes the burden of responsibility. And I know people would prefer not to have to get involved and not to have to make a few sacrifices in their lives and maybe make a few amendments and maybe spend a bit of time that they would prefer to use watching movies or going down the pub or playing a sports game or whatever to do something more constructive that's actually helpful towards the future generations of humanity. But that's the situation that we find ourselves in. That's the message that I'm leaving people with, and I say the final chapter is waiting to be written because we really are the generation that is going to decide whether we get thrown into that prison cell that is being prepared for us, or whether we say to ourselves collectively, enough. We're not having this. We've got the numbers. We're in control, not a few 100,000 bloody psychopaths, demented maniacs, but the rest of us, the rest of the population in this world. We are going to dictate what our future is. We want the right to be able to live peacefully with each other and enjoy our families and enjoy everything great that life has to offer. But we're being impeded from doing so by just a few bloody, psychotic arseholes. And we're not having it anymore. So are we collectively going to make that decision, or are we going to allow ourselves to have the prison door slammed on us? Only those of us alive today, as adults today, are going to make that decision. And that's what it comes down to. Unpopular, I know, but the truth.
There it is. Yep. It all boils down to what are you prepared to do? Okay. So as far as all the chapters go, this ends the book, but there is someone who has decided to do something, and that's Dan Monroe. And I guess his contribution was to write an essay. And I think you found this so powerful or worthwhile that you decided to include it in your book. And I see it under Appendix 1. So you want to finish up by telling us why this is in the book?
Yeah, Dan Monroe is a guy that I met on a radio show called Planet X in Liverpool. When it's one of the first radio shows that I guested on, actually, after waking up. And he's now since moved to Australia. But he contacted me a couple of years ago, and this was just before Prince died. So we had no idea what was going to happen. But he said, I'm a lifelong fan of Prince, and I've been analysing the themes that crop up in his music, album by album, as his career developed. And I want to put together this essay. So he did that, and I saw it, and I thought, this is really great work. Very comprehensive. He's looking at the amazing dichotomy that there seems to be between the themes that Prince talks about in his music. So most people probably think of him for talking about sex and just being lascivious and dirty-minded and sleazy, because most of his tracks that were hits are on that kind of sleazy side. But he made the point that when you look at the albums, every time he makes a track talking about sin and descending into base consciousness and worldly desires and things like that, there's always a track to balance it out that talks about spirituality and redemption. And it's almost like he had one side of him that was trapped in this base consciousness and all these carnal desires, but there was always an aspect of him that was steeped in higher consciousness that sought redemption and deliverance and spiritual escape from this world. And it's very interesting the way Dan has put all this together and shown how these themes developed through his music. Loads of occult symbolism cropped up. There's lots there to demonstrate that Prince moved in such circles to have had very advanced inside knowledge of how secret societies work and how occult groups work. And he was communicating a lot of this in his music right from the start. So a very complex character, and I think Dan's essay goes places that, again, no other writers have gone.
All right, then. So I guess that completes everything about the book. So for people that want to purchase this, if they're listening to this podcast, they obviously know about your site. But for some of the people who might stumble upon this episode by chance or through other methods, how can they get a hold of you, this book, and everything else that you have to offer? All
right. So the book is available in paperback, hardback, and Kindle versions. The paperback version is £20. It's available on Amazon. You can get it pretty much worldwide from Amazon. Just put in Mark Devlin, Musical Truth, Volume 2. The hardback is available from Lightning Source and various other outlets. But if people are interested in the hardback, they can email me on markdevlinuk@gmail.com. So that's the best address to get me on now, markdevlinuk@gmail.com. And also, if people want to email me on that address and they would like a signed copy of the book sent out by me personally, I'm very happy to do that. If they can pay by PayPal, I can get the book out to them. It translates into a better deal for me financially, so it supports my work, and it cuts out Amazon, who aren't the most ethical company in the world. And I know a lot of people are quite keen to cut Amazon out of the equation. So drop me an email and we can just have a private arrangement like that. The Kindle version is available through Amazon and through other sources like Barnes & Noble and other outlets as well. There's going to be an audio version of both books on the way. That's not done yet. I've still got to voice all that. It'll be done at some point. But yeah, in the first instance, Amazon is a good bet, particularly in places like Australia and far-flung corners of the world where it costs a lot for me to mail out to them. Amazon might be your best bet. But for listeners in the UK, Europe, or even the US, I can mail out copies. So drop me a line. Again, markdevlinuk@gmail.com. Just want to mention the website, which is musicaltruthbook.com. I'm going to be posting up all my radio interviews related to the book there and YouTube videos of my conference presentations and other stuff related to it. And the main port of call is markdevlin.co.uk for all my work. There's links through to the Good Vibrations podcast archive, The Sound of Freedom, which is my conscious music podcast, and my YouTube videos from there as well. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, and for those listeners out there who catch this show pretty soon before March and they're in the Southwest U.S., they can meet you in person, right? Los Angeles and Phoenix. Phoenix, you'll be at my conference, Truth, Mind, Reality, March 10th. And a few days later, they can catch you at a book signing in Los Angeles, March 14th, I believe. Correct?
Well, that's right, yeah. So first off, I'm going to be at your event, and I just want to commend you for putting that on. You know, you don't just talk the talk, you walk in the talk, you did something. So respect for that. So I'm going to be guesting at that alongside the likes of Mark Passio, Lennon Honor, Sonia Barrett, and a bunch of local speakers from the Phoenix area. Then a few days after that, 14th of March, I'm going to be at Mystic Journey Bookstore in Venice, Los Angeles, doing a talk and a signing there. So for any SoCal heads, get yourself down there and I'll see you.
All right. So I guess that ends this show. And now I guess I have to reluctantly give the show back to you, Mark. So take care, and I'll talk to you soon, and I'll see you in Phoenix.
Thanks for guest hosting, man. It's interesting to have turned the tables, but I'll take that baton back from you now, and I'll see you in Phoenix in March, brother. Thanks for all your help.
This is just for fun.
I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up